A few months ago, I made this desk for myself. I also made a build video about that, which you can watch after this one if you like. But whilst I was making that desk, I was thinking that the design would really lend itself to a pretty sleek dining table. I've just finished fitting out a composer studio with a bunch of acoustic panels and audio gear equipment racks and other bits and pieces. And I'd purchased quite a lot of this 150mm by 25mm Tasmanian oak, and decided that I might as well make a dining table with the leftovers and scratch that itch of transferring the desk design to a dining table. So here's the design of the table, and obviously it's quite simple, but like the desk, it's the small details that I'm planning on implementing that will hopefully elevate it from being basic to elegant. I'm not making this table for a client, rather I'm making it for my own portfolio and website to hopefully sell more of in the future. The simplicity of the design will hopefully mean it's fairly easy to produce and scalable to whatever size, sort of within reason, a client might want. It's also fairly light, as the top is only 25mm thick, and the base is fairly rudimentary, which also helps keep the cost of wood reasonable and the total weight down. It's definitely not a farmyard style table that's sort of built to withstand a tornado, but it's absolutely strong enough for normal dining table activities.
So far I've just been milling these boards up, and initially I was a bit disappointed that they weren't a bit more even in colour. And there are a few minor defects in these boards, but as the build went on, I gradually became more fond of these pieces, as I think they've got a nice bit of character to them.
I'm adding dominoes to these boards to help align everything while it glues up. Once this is all glued up, there's obviously no putting it back through a thicknesser again, so the dominoes really just help to keep the boards from slipping up or down during the glue up, and it just sort of helps to reduce the sanding time, as ideally each board should be pretty close to flush with the next board along. The dominoes really don't do much to keep the panel flat, and I realised that I usually skip over this gluing up process for panels like this, so this is my go-to glue up process. Essentially what I have is 3 planks that are all the same height, which allows the pipe clamps to slide under the panel, and it also allows the middle of the clamp to engage with the panel, which really helps to avoid cupping or warping under clamping pressure. The middle plank is mainly just there to hold everything up. I then add clamping coals to either end, and I've drilled nice big holes in the planks at the end which allow the coals to clamp the panel flat. And that's about it really. Nothing overly expensive, and it usually leaves me with a nice flat panel. Now that I've got the top panel glued up, I can get on with making the legs. If I was going to make this part from a solid square piece of stock, it would need to be incredibly thick, so what I'm going to do instead is cut a thinner piece in half and then fold it around on itself. This is quite a cool look as well, as the face grain wraps around the corner, kind of like what you get with a waterfall table. After marking each piece to make sure I don't get them mixed up, I rip them all in half. I then roughly draw on the angle of the bits that need to be removed, again just to make sure I don't get confused, and then rip off said bit. And hopefully once these parts come back together, it should look pretty close to being seamless across the board.
I made this template off camera. It's pretty basic, it's just made out of some 9mm MDF. And after tracing that onto these legs, I try and cut those parts out as close to the line as possible.
Then over at the router table, I can finish these parts off. To avoid climb cutting, half the parts needed the template to be on the top, which is a little bit tricky to avoid tipping the piece and causing the router bit to take off too much. Then for the other half, I could stick the template to the underside, and that was much less stressful. Again, I'm using the domino for its alignment purposes rather than its strength purposes, and in this case it's to stop the parts from slipping all over the place as I glue them back together. I'm giving these inside parts a sand before they get glued back together, as it's just going to be a bit of a pain to sand them once it's all glued up. And I'm trying to keep the glue closer to the outside edge to avoid squeeze out on the inside edge. And this is definitely a time where I wish I had more clamps. Once the leg parts have dried, I can give them a big old round over. I didn't really need to start sanding these parts just yet, but I was pretty keen to see how the waterfall effect was looking, and I was really happy with how tight the joins came out. The next step was to cut out the end aprons. I kept the cut-offs from the legs that I removed at the bandsaw earlier, and these came in handy for marking up for dominoes, and also a bit later when it came time for glue up. Before I glued these parts together, I added that same large radius to the underside of the apron and also added a small round over to the inside edges of the legs.
I put some playing cards down on top of this offcut, and that compensates for the thickness of the bandsaw blade and the little bit that I removed at the router table. And that just helps this part sit parallel to the table whilst I glue it up.
So whilst that's drying, I'm going to make a bunch of these little tabletop hold down buttons. There's obviously a heap of ways you can hold a tabletop to the base, but I reckon these definitely look the coolest, especially if you're one of those people who likes to stick your head under the table and see how everything comes together. The main function of the button is to allow it to move side to side in the mortise and also in and out, which just allows the tabletop to expand and contract. And I've exaggerated a bit here, but it's good to leave a small gap between the top of the button and the base of the tabletop, so when you put a screw through the button, it can actually pull the tabletop down. I'm making these buttons from walnut, and I know most people don't look under a table, but if someone does, I'm hoping that the contrasting woods will look pretty schmick. Ideally, the grain would be running horizontally through the button, and mine wasn't quite horizontal, but I'll be dealing with that issue a bit later on. After giving all those buttons a sand, I could get back to the legs, which have now dried, and carve the transition from the large round over of the apron into the small round over on the legs. I really like this detail. I think it looks really interesting, but it's also a really fun tactile process to carve it, and it's also nice to do something relatively quiet. Next up is the frame section of the table base.
On future tables, I could probably afford to make this part have another extra cross piece or two to stiffen up the whole base, but honestly, I just didn't have enough wood for this one. The base did end up being pretty stiff, so it probably doesn't ever need any more, and really, a table doesn't ever get that much force applied to it, so I don't know, how strong does it actually need to be? I'm saying this like the table ended up being flimsy, which it absolutely didn't, but I probably wouldn't condone it being used for like a stage for a school play or something like that.
I decided to pre-finish the ends of these cross members to avoid any annoying glue cleanup. I sometimes use painter's tape in situations like this, but I've had sort of varying levels of success, and I thought I'd just give this method a go. Once the glue dries on the oiled section, it's just much easier to clean off with a sharp chisel than if it was unsealed timber.
And the final finish that I apply will blend into that oil without any problems.
Again, I'm adding that large round over to the base of these longer aprons, and then I can glue these parts up.
Check out this cute little butcher bird that flew in to give me a hand with my glue up. It's come back and visited me a few times, so I'm pretty confident that it hasn't glued itself to a tree.
I used the old clamp from corner to corner trick just to make sure that everything came out perfectly square. I probably could have waited till this glue was a bit firmer before I cleaned it up, but it was definitely a lot easier than a normal cleanup job.
The next step was to finally glue the rest of the table together, and unfortunately I didn't have any feathered assistance with this one.
After the table base had dried, I came back and added a shadow line to the top of the base. I had a little bit of a whoopsie here where I didn't quite tighten my collet enough and the bit began to come loose. Luckily there was no major harm done, but I did end up having to take a little bit more off on this shadow line than what I'd intended.
I'd left a bit of excess length on the ends of the tabletop, so it was time to chop that off.
I'm going to round over these corners to the same radius as the legs, and here I'm removing a bit of the excess material before I can come back with my router and a template bit and finish it off. I'm adding that leg to apron transition to the long sides of the table here. It's definitely a lot more awkward doing this once the table's fully assembled, but there really isn't a better way of doing this part. Here I'm adding the grooves into the aprons for the buttons to slot into. I'm using the 10mm cutter in the domino and it's on the widest setting. After doing a bunch of sanding off camera, as that's super boring to watch, I could add a coat of oil to the base. Earlier I mentioned that for the buttons it's probably a good idea to have the grain running horizontally, and mine sort of run at a 45-degree angle. And I did do a test on one and it seemed pretty strong, but I decided to add some screws to the end just as a precaution. It doesn't really look very nice, but it's going to be buried in the mortise anyway, so no one's going to be able to see it. Finally I could get on with actually attaching the tabletop to the base, and this is a super satisfying process. On my desk that I showed earlier, I rounded over the top, but on this table I'm just going to break the edge over with some sandpaper and leave it more or less square. I'll do a little side by side in a second, and I'd love to hear which version you prefer, the rounded over version or the more sort of square, crisp version. After adding a couple of coats of oil and a wax polish, this table was done. Thanks for watching.